Welcome to QueerTWENTY, the cohort of 2022. QueerTWENTY is egomonk's annual flagship program where we celebrate exceptional queer Indians excelling in fields such as social justice, science, commerce, arts, business, etc. Today we have a very interesting person with us, Raju Behara. Raju is a genderqueer, pan-romantic, neurodivergent person. They work for Novartis India as their Senior Analyst, and they also are engaged as an independent researcher with Queer Judgment Project. What drives Raju is a very beautiful thing, which is to create and sustain safe spaces for other queers through peer support. What also excites Raju is poetry. So without further ado, let's welcome Raju and let's dive into this conversation. They say it takes a village to raise a child. What was or who was your village?
Yeah, firstly, thank you for having me as a part of the cohort. It's such a privilege to be here. So in terms of, I agree with the fact that it takes a village to raise a kid. So in my case, I would start with my mother. My parental family has always been a guiding source. Like my mom has always been so supportive of my identity, of my journeys, and I think that's actually been the first point where I learned safe expression and understood what psychological safety means in home. So I always had that thing. So even when I came out to my mother, she was very forthcoming and open about acceptance. But also I've been blessed with a huge chosen family. I have a couple of very close friends who have guided me in my life journey, whom I can always rely on in any adverse scenario or even to celebrate my nicer moments. So I think they have always been one of the guiding forces again. So I learned about intersectional struggles. So most of my friends come from different backgrounds. So that has also been a huge journey for me in order to understand what privilege looks like and how privilege can translate into when we practice different things in our life.
Through your writing, through your published writing, your articles, you have spoken, you have been vocal about childhood trauma and the way it impacts a child and a child that grows into the adult. Could you share with us, like, where exactly are you right now on your journey of healing this childhood trauma, and what are the tools or practices that have helped you through this?
So I mean, to begin with, each and every queer person or queer identity is addled with childhood trauma. It's very rare that you find queer people who had really happy childhoods. But having said that, also being neurodivergent comes with its own set of traumatic experiences. So far, like I said in the last question where we talked about chosen families and families, it's always been the case that I've had a support system, which I've also been in a very privileged upbringing. So, I mean, when you have both of them together, you always have a sort of insulation when you look at your childhood traumatic experiences.
Sadly, a lot of us have endured unsafe childhoods. Actually, queer or not, a lot of us have endured unsafe childhoods, and traumatized kids tend to become anxious adults. Do you have any advice for those adults whose past experiences echo their present lives?
Yeah, I think having experienced quite a few traumatic experiences through my life, I would say that trauma, like you very clearly said, right, growth is always non-linear, healing is also non-linear, and similarly, healing from trauma is also a very complex process. So I think first thing what we need to do, something I learned from my therapist, is we need to normalize anxieties. So being anxious is also a way of our life. But however, having said that, when anxiety starts affecting your daily life in such a way that it's delimiting, it affects your regular day-to-day activities, then something that has always helped is grounding exercises and the belief in the fact that there is a safe space for each one of us. My work has always been on finding and reimagining safe spaces for queer folks. So because I struggled for finding one for quite a lot of time in my life, so to understand what safe space means to each of us, it could be through your sensory perceptions. So when I say grounding, it's not like how we look at it from a psychotherapeutic angle. It's also from a very closely driven community perspective of what safe space would mean to each one of us. So it could be like understanding a tactile sense, like touching an object that makes you feel immediately safe. For instance, being around my cat Maya helped me allay the anxieties that we faced during the pandemic. I could not have imagined getting through the pandemic without her. So like that could be one thing, like hearing your pet like purr or touching your cat's fur to just sort of soothe yourself from that anxiety that's coming out. Alternatively, it could be reading a poem or reading something that immediately brings you a lot of strength. So I believe that reading Maya Angelou's poems or reading Audre Lorde's work has always been like a source of like immense strength for me, because you hear such experiences and you realize there's so much more in life that we can be on and look forward to.
In your writing, you have explored topics of how educational systems have the potential of creating safe spaces for children, but how this potential is heavily underutilized, especially when it comes to queer and neurodivergent kids. So, how do you think schools can strive better to be inclusive of neurodivergent and queer identities?
So firstly, I think in Indian educational systems, or even when we look at most of the Indian educational queer experiences, right? So there's barely any safe space for gender expression. So far, I think even I mentioned in that article that I wrote in Gacy, but also in several other spaces where I actually was chairing a few panels, that when we have queer children expressing their gender identity, it's always into two boxes. So I remember, throughout my childhood, there was only two gendered washrooms. There were two gendered lines that you have to stand in, the boys queue versus the girls queue, and then there are boy specific sports, there are girl specific sports. So I think so I never liked any sports for that reason. So probably I think that could be one of the causes, because the idea of sports itself becomes traumatizing. And I was just talking to a friend recently, and she mentioned how like for her, so she likes playing cricket. And she likes being very butch and masculine. So she was explaining how for her playing cricket is also a very strong innate form of expressing what her gender means to her. So essentially when we have these brackets, when we have this well-defined lines, so automatically the ones who are non-binary, the ones who do not fall into these two clear well-defined brackets, are the ones to suffer. And then when we look at neurodivergent identities, I think it gets even more murkier, because there is no space for neurodivergent identities in like childhood. Fortunately, I fell under the high performing category of neurodivergent, so I am a high performing ADHD kid. So I've always been blessed that way. But then I've also seen like quite a few. So I volunteered and taught in a school for like 3 years. During that point of time, I had a student who was dyslexic. And because I was teaching biology, it was easier to understand and explain, it's very clear to look at how a dyslexic child would process lessons, how a dyslexic kid would go through answering their examinations, right? So how much is a system attuned to working with kids of neurodivergent identities? I think we need to like reflect back on. The most tragic part is very recently, I think around last year, there was this wonderful manual released on queer affirming, trans affirming educational guidelines for NCRT. However, it was pulled back with a lot of force, and I feel that's a very important document if it was published, because you work closely with the community, you draft the guidelines which are in fact built by people who have lived experiences, who have actually spent a lot of energy into critiquing the existing system versus also providing solutions working through the system. So, but then you don't have these guidelines in available domains anymore. So, how is it that we would create the idea of a safe space? I would be amiss if we failed to mention RV's death in DPS, which triggered the article I wrote for Gacy, right? So, that's just one case. That's just one case which got visibility. There are several thousands of queer neurodivergent experiences which probably do not get recorded, which do not get spoken loud enough for us to create an impactful change. And then these traumatizing childhoods sort of translate into traumatic adulthood experiences, and it just propagates an intergenerational series of violence, which I think we need to really closely reflect on. And they should be, I think, starting with the NCRT guidelines perhaps, and several more other educational systems in adapting these guidelines and having drafted such core changes which actually impact everything from the grassroots level, like training teachers enough, having other systems in place to ensure that children are not the ones who are getting adversely affected due to the lack of systemic awareness.
You have observed educational spaces from lived experience, and even after you got away from that space, and you are currently in the workforce and observing things. So when you speak about how from an early age educational institutions tend to exclude queer and neurodivergent identities, have you by any chance observed any similar patterns that permeate through work culture? What I'm trying to ask is the patterns or the problems that queers and neurodivergent folks face in a heteronormative workplace, is it an extension of the school systems that are exclusionary?
I think yes. So I've seen quite a few patterns that we observe in schools and in colleges. So essentially, I think there's this wonderful series on Netflix, Sex Education, which talked about the good queer and the bad queer. So I think this is what we see in workplaces. So also the good neurodivergent and the bad neurodivergent. So this is what we see in workplaces also. So there's a queer person who can form the identity, who can also the identity, the brand ambassador of the queerness of the organization. So however, there are I think there's the other side, the dark side of organizations probably, who have I know for a fact that I've heard from very close friends who have faced traumatizing experiences because they were not allowed to express their gender. I think it could be the length of their hair, it could be the way they were dressing. There was this constant, harassment falls short when you use a word like that. The amount of violence they faced at their workplace. And then I understand, being queer, being non-binary at workplace also requires you to afford a certain kind of wardrobe, a certain variety of dressing, a certain way of carrying yourself. So I think it's also that just the right amount. I think it's important even for corporates to have queer trans employees in the workforce who can lead these conversations, allies who are equipped enough, who understand queer trans lived experiences, also coming from intersections. So one thing I remember very vividly in my workplace, this was 4 years ago or so, there was this colleague of mine who was talking about, so essentially there was a transphobic comment made. So one colleague was talking about how they were going through metro and they heard they felt that trans people traveling through metro, or also as in probably non-binary people in this case, I don't know, trans non-binary identity, someone in the process. So they were they were not really clear about the identity, but yeah, some trans non-binary person walking through the metro was apparently dressed in a very flashy way, was dressed in a manner that did not fall into their ideas of gender notions, their gendered, their form of gender expression. So personally, from the conversation, what I conferred was this person was trying to be femme but not femme enough to pass. So not having the passing privilege, so this colleague started saying how there are a lot of trans people who start transitioning fairly late in their life, and because of that, it went on to a range of transphobia about how they define what transness looks like from a cis heteronormative perspective, and then it eventually ended in them saying because it does not fit into their definition of transness, they are basically lying. Their transness is a method of basically dishonesty, and by nature of that, it makes them a dishonest workplace colleague. So at this point of time, I was not out and open in that workplace. So I was not comfortable to take this conversation either. Though, I clearly was from the community, I did not want to bring this out. At that point of time, I still do have a lot of passing privilege. If I cut my hair short, if I dress a certain way, I can pass as a cis man. So that gives me the privilege, but for people who do not pass. So this conversation was happening right behind me. And then there was this colleague who was talking from the point of, so she was a Muslim woman, and she said, you're asking the same questions that people would ask me, and you're also a Muslim man, and you say, when she wanted to wear hijab or when she doesn't wear hijab, the conversations that come out, and also the fact that her femininity is being pointed out by nature of being Muslim, and then she draw the analogies, the lived experience of being a Muslim woman versus the lived experience of being a trans woman. And she also brought in a very strong case of allyship by pointing a very specific trans experience that she had, like a colleague, which both of them knew, who transitioned later on. And I think that's when this colleague understood what transness or what trans experiences could be like. So what I understood from the conversation was having shared lived experiences. It doesn't need to be essentially queer. It could be another case of marginalization. It could be neurodivergent. It could be disability. This is the strong knowledge of why we need allyship coming in from different spaces.
So Raju, last question. Because you have worked in corporate settings, you continue to work in corporate settings. What would be your advice to corporate India, to managers of neurodivergent teams, to best accommodate and best support queer and neurodivergent workforce?
Sure. So I think firstly I would like to speak about some affirming experiences I've had at Novartis in relation to this question. Strong employee resource groups play a vital role in supporting and nurturing a diverse workforce. Allyship is a fundamental key to running such spaces, and it's important to have workspaces that sustain these allyship initiatives in formal capacities. At Novartis, AGLO, the hierarchy for LGBTQIA+ community and allies, had hosted few conversations with people coming from intersectional queer and neurodivergent spaces. So ERGs can impact organizations not just through these conversations but also through policy change. As seen in my current workplace, where the ERGs work closely with the DE&I leaders to drive sustainable, long-lasting, impactful change. And also, they have dress code policies and workplace speak-up cells that encourage this reporting. Simultaneously, I also had the chance to listen to more leaders coming from intersectional spaces at Out and Equal Summit. I feel that visibility through strong leadership and representation at different levels to the organizational hierarchy builds a culture of empowerment for people with different diverse identities. More importantly, I think an unbossed culture that could be used to drive empathetic conversation that go beyond the hierarchies that we see which guide most corporate spaces, and instead they empower the individual to spearhead the change at an individual and also at an organizational level. Could be one of the changes that we need at the moment in corporate India to truly go towards a diverse workplace.
Within the LGBTQ plus community, who needs the outsized support?
Sorry, within the LGBTQI plus community?
Within the LGBTQ plus community, who needs the outsized support? Outsized.
Outsized as in?
As in the largest, the most prioritized support?
Trans and non-binary community and the intersex communities.
Okay. Who is your queer role model?
My queer role model, I've had several, but for this interview I think I would go with Shivangi, a disability rights activist.
What's the best thing about being queer?
The best thing about being queer is you choose to own whatever you want to do. Like you own up your identity, you own up your space, and you don't really need to subscribe to the cis heteronormative norms.
Who is your favorite queer character on screen?
My favorite queer character. Until recently there were many, but now I think it's Wednesday from Adam's Family.
Yeah. What is one thing that scares you?
One thing that scares me up. I think the most terrifying fear is when we do not understand the intersections from which people come from, and automatically we inflict violence despite being a part of a queer community. Not understanding how we are capable of inflicting violence on others and not undoing the violence that has been inflicted onto ourselves.
What inspires you the most?
So I think my strongest inspiration is the struggle to survival. I think Audre Lorde's words, that the litany of survival, right? So I think that's my strongest inspiration, and I think throughout my life, Audre Lorde and Maya Angelou are my most inspirational figures. So their poetry.
Okay. So I am going to say certain words and I would like your immediate reactions. These could be verbal, these could very well be non-verbal. Okay. Workplace equity.
Diversity.
Homophobia.
Transphobia.
Allyship.
Friends.
Ambition.
Community.
Politics.
Nonplussed.
India.
Safety.
Okay.